3 days before Christmas, my neighbor tried to accuse me of destroying his property during the worst snowstorm our town had seen in almost 10 years. And if the city hadn't accidentally recorded everything, I probably would have ended up paying thousands for damage I didn't cause. The crazy part is, this whole thing didn't start with snow. It started months earlier, over something so stupid I almost feel embarrassed explaining it now. A parking spot. I live in a little neighborhood outside Duluth, Minnesota. One of those quiet streets where everybody pretends to be friendly, but secretly keeps score over everything. Whose grass is greener, whose dog barks too much, who leaves trash cans out too long after pickup day. My house sits across from this older guy named Walter Grady. Late 60s, retired contractor, always wearing those tinted yellow glasses like he was permanently about to inspect somebody's roof. Walter had this habit of acting like the entire street belonged to him. If someone parked too close to his side of the curb, he'd stand at the window staring until they moved. If kids rode bikes across the edge of his lawn, he'd come outside with his hands on his hips like a sheriff in an old western. At first I ignored it because honestly, every neighborhood has one guy like that. But after my divorce, when I moved into the house full-time, things got weird. I think Walter decided I was an easy target, single woman, quiet, worked from home, kept mostly to myself. The first real issue happened in October when my younger brother Caleb came over to help me move furniture into the garage before winter. He parked his truck on the street for maybe 2 hours. That evening, Walter marched over and told me, "This isn't apartment living, sweetheart. People here respect curb space." I remember just blinking at him because, curb space? It was public parking. Caleb almost lost it laughing. But Walter didn't laugh. He just stood there chewing the inside of his cheeks staring at us like we'd insulted him personally. After that, little things started happening. Someone reported my mailbox for leaning too far toward the road. Animal control somehow got an anonymous complaint that my golden retriever Duke was aggressive, which was hilarious because Duke is terrified of ceiling fans and once got bullied by a corgi. Then right before Thanksgiving, Walter cornered me while I was shoveling leaves and said, "You know, snowplows can't maneuver properly when people clutter the curb." I actually laughed because there wasn't even snow yet. He didn't. He just nodded slowly and walked back inside. Looking back now, I honestly think he'd already built this entire narrative in his head long before the storm ever happened. Then December hit, and Minnesota stopped being cute. The snowstorm rolled in overnight like something out of a disaster movie. Wind screaming through the trees, power flickering every 20 minutes, snow piling so fast you could barely see tire tracks disappear before your eyes. Around 2 in the morning I woke up because Duke started barking at the windows. I looked outside and the whole street had vanished under white drifts. The city plows were already out grinding down the road, huge orange lights glowing through the snow like ships moving through fog. By morning my driveway was buried. My Subaru looked like somebody had dumped a wedding cake over it. I made coffee, wrapped myself in an old sweatshirt, and stood by the window watching the plows crawl through the neighborhood again. Honestly, it was peaceful for maybe 10 minutes. Then came the pounding at my front door. Not knocking, pounding. Duke started barking like somebody was breaking in. I opened the door and there stood Walter, red-faced, snow blowing around him, holding a stack of printed photos in one hand like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. "There she is," he snapped before I could even say good morning. "You finally gonna admit what you did?" I remember just staring at him, still half asleep holding my coffee mug, thinking, what in the hell is this man talking about? He shoved one of the pictures toward my face. It showed the curb in front of his driveway completely torn up, chunks of frozen sod scattered into the snow. Deep scrape marks cut through the edge of the concrete. "Your car caused this," he said. "Plow had to swing wide because of where you parked." I looked past him at my own driveway. My Subaru was literally still buried under snow. You couldn't even see the windshield. "Walter," I said slowly, "my car hasn't moved in 2 days." His jaw tightened. That's not what I heard. And right there, something in my stomach dropped, because it suddenly didn't feel like confusion anymore. It felt personal. Walter kept staring at me like he was waiting for me to crack under pressure and confess to some crime I didn't even understand. Snow whipped between us across the porch while Duke growled behind my legs, low and uneasy, which honestly should have told me everything, because that dog loved everybody. I took another look at the photos. The damage was real, no question about that. The curb in front of Walter's driveway looked like somebody had dragged a steel blade across it hard enough to rip concrete loose, and there were tire grooves frozen into the snow nearby. But none of it made sense. My driveway still had untouched snow layered across the entrance. No tracks. No fresh marks. Nothing. You can literally see my car hasn't moved, I told him. Walter shrugged like facts were optional. Doesn't matter now. I already called Public Works. They took your plate number. Then he leaned a little closer and lowered his voice. People around here are getting tired of your little entitlement act. That one caught me off guard because until then I genuinely thought this was just about the curb. Entitlement, I said. Walter, I barely even talked to anybody. He gave this dry little laugh that sounded almost disappointed. Exactly. Then he turned and stomped back across the snow toward his house, shoulders stiff, leaving me standing there wondering how a man could carry that much bitterness around before breakfast. The whole thing should have blown over. That's the part that still amazes me. Any reasonable person wouldn't oppose. V looked outside, seen my untouched driveway, and realized immediately the timing didn't add up. But people like Walter don't operate on logic once they've decided they need a villain. They operate on ego. And ego will drag somebody a long way past common sense if you let it. Around noon, my friend Tessa called. She lived 2 houses down, and apparently Walter had already started making rounds up and down the street telling people I'd blocked the Plow route and caused city damage. Tessa actually sounded embarrassed relaying it to me. I didn't believe him, she said, but he's really pushing this story. I remember sitting there at my kitchen table staring out at the snowbanks thinking how weird adulthood is because nobody warns you that grown people gossip exactly like middle schoolers, just with mortgages and blood pressure medication. Then Tessa got quiet for a second before saying, "You know Walter's been furious ever since the Henderson property sold to you, right?" I frowned. Why? Because he wanted his nephew to buy it. That was the first time the puzzle pieces shifted into place. The Henderson house had belonged to an elderly couple before they moved into assisted living. Walter apparently assumed the property would stay within the neighborhood circle, whatever that meant. But after my divorce, I bought it fast with cash from the settlement because I needed somewhere stable to start over. Walter never said anything directly about it, but suddenly a lot of his behavior made sense. To him, I wasn't really a neighbor. I was an outsider who ended up in a house he thought belonged to somebody else. And once somebody like Walter decides you don't belong, every little thing becomes evidence supporting that belief. Over the next week, the storm cleanup dragged on, and the neighborhood slowly thawed back to life, but Walter kept escalating. He filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming my vehicle obstructed snow removal operations. Then somebody from Public Works actually came out and took photos of both properties. The worker looked exhausted, like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. He glanced at my snow-covered Subaru and quietly muttered, "Huh," under his breath before writing something on his clipboard. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 7 days later, I opened my mailbox and found a thick certified envelope. Civil claim. Walter was suing me for $4,200. Not just for curb repairs now, but landscaping damage, loss of property value, and something called snow mitigation expenses, which I later learned basically meant he tried charging me for his own shoveling. I actually laughed when I read that part. Not because it was funny exactly. More, because it was so absurd my brain didn't know what else to do. Then the panic kicked in. I'd never been sued before. I called my older sister Rachel, and she immediately said the words every older sibling says when chaos hits. Okay, first of all, don't panic. Which of course made me panic harder. By that afternoon, she connected me with an attorney named Evan Mercer, a local guy in his 40s who looked permanently undercaffeinated, but had this calm way of talking that made you feel like maybe civilization would survive after all. I brought him the complaint paperwork along with Walter's photos. Evan studied them quietly for a minute, then asked, "Your car really never left the driveway?" "Not once," I said. "I work remote. I ordered groceries that week." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because if he's lying very confidently." That sentence stuck with me. Confidently. Because Walter wasn't acting like somebody mistaken. He was acting like somebody who thought he'd already won. Evan asked me to walk him through the storm timeline minute by minute. While we talked, he kept circling one detail. The tire tracks in Walter's photos. "You said the street was still actively being plowed?" "Yeah." "Then why are these tracks so clean?" I looked closer. He was right. The grooves in the snow extended past Walter's property without interruption, almost like they'd been created by a larger vehicle moving continuously down the block. Not a parked car pulling out temporarily. Evan leaned back in his chair. You know what I think? What? I think your neighbor saw damage after the storm and reverse engineered a target. The hearing got scheduled right after New Year's. Longest 2 weeks of my life. Every time I left the house, I could feel Walter watching from behind his curtains. One morning, I found fresh shovel snow dumped partly across my driveway entrance. Another night, somebody knocked over my trash cans into the street. No proof it was him, obviously, but the message felt clear enough. What bothered me most wasn't even the lawsuit anymore. It was the feeling of being slowly pushed out of my own neighborhood by somebody who thought he had seniority over reality itself. Then, 3 days before the hearing, Evan called me sounding more awake than usual, which immediately made me nervous. I found something, he said. Turns out every city snowplow now carried GPS tracking and forward-facing dash cameras for insurance purposes. Public Works initially resisted handing anything over until Evan filed a formal records request, but they finally released the route logs. According to the timestamp, a plow passed Walter's house at 2:47 a.m. during peak accumulation. Okay, I said carefully. Evan's voice lowered just slightly. And based on blade position data, the plow experienced lateral impact directly in front of his property. I sat there blinking. Meaning, he said, I think the city accidentally recorded exactly what destroyed that curb. Suddenly the whole thing changed. Up until then I'd felt defensive, cornered, stressed out all the time. But now I wanted to see Walter's face when the truth walked into that courtroom. And deep down, I think part of me already knew something else too. This had stopped being about property damage a long time ago. Walter needed me to lose because if I didn't, he'd have to confront the fact that he'd built an entire personal crusade around resentment, loneliness, and pride. Some people would rather burn down relationships, reputations, even their own dignity before admitting they were wrong. And Walter was exactly that kind of person. The morning of the hearing, the temperature dropped to 8 below zero, and the whole town felt frozen solid. I remember sitting in Evan's truck outside the county courthouse watching people shuffle through the snow with their shoulders hunched up around their ears, thinking how ridiculous it was that my entire January was being consumed by a fight over a curb I didn't even damage. Evan was sipping terrible gas station coffee, flipping through his notes like it was just another Tuesday. You nervous? He asked. Honestly, I said. I'm more angry than nervous now. He nodded once. Good. Anger keeps people alert. Panic makes them stupid. Inside the courtroom, Walter was already there. Of course he was. He sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a pressed flannel jacket like he was auditioning for the role of respectable local citizen. And for the first few minutes, I'll admit, he looked confident. Too confident. He kept chatting with another older guy from the neighborhood, occasionally glancing back toward me with this smug little expression like he couldn't wait for the judge to make an example out of me. Then I noticed something else. 3 different neighbors had shown up just to watch. Small towns are brutal that way. People smell drama, and suddenly court becomes live entertainment. Walter stood first, and man, the performance he gave was unbelievable. He pointed dramatically at enlarged printouts of the curb damage while talking about community responsibility and reckless parking behavior. At one point, he actually sighed and said, I've lived on that street for 32 years, Your Honor. We've never had issues until recently. Recently. He made sure to emphasize that word while staring directly at me, like I was some infection that had arrived in the neighborhood. Then came the part that genuinely irritated me. Walter started talking about my divorce. Not directly, but indirectly enough for everybody to understand. Some residents, he said carefully, move into communities without understanding how things are done. I felt my face get hot instantly. Evan put a hand on my arm before I could react. Let him talk, he whispered. People like this always overplay their hand. And Walter absolutely did. He kept rambling, getting more emotional, more self-righteous, until finally the judge interrupted him and asked the most important question of the entire hearing. Mr. Grady, she said, did you personally witness the defendant's vehicle causing this damage? Walter hesitated. Just for a second. I saw the aftermath. That wasn't my question. Another pause. No. But the evidence clearly indicates. We'll decide what the evidence indicates, the judge replied flatly. That tiny shift in the room changed everything. You could almost feel Walter losing control of the narrative in real time. Then it was Evan's turn. He stood calmly, adjusted his glasses, and walked toward the evidence photos Walter had submitted. "Interesting tire patterns," he said casually. "They continue nearly half a block uninterrupted." Walter folded his arms. "Because her vehicle traveled down the street." Evan nodded slowly. "So your testimony is that her parked Subaru somehow produced continuous commercial with track spacing through active snowfall conditions?" Walter blinked. What? And that right, there was the moment panic finally flickered across his face. Evan turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, we requested city operational records from the Department of Public Works, including GPS telemetry and dash camera footage from the snowplow servicing Hawthorne Lane during the storm." Walter's expression changed instantly. I swear to God, the color drained out of that man so fast, it looked medically concerning. The courtroom monitor flickered on. Grainy nighttime footage appeared on the screen, snow blasting through the headlights in thick sideways waves. The plow crawled down our street, blade angled toward the curb. Timestamp, 2:47 a.m. Everybody leaned forward slightly. Then it happened. The blade clipped a frozen manhole cover hidden beneath the snowpack and jolted violently sideways with this horrible metallic scrape that echoed through the speakers. Sparks flashed briefly across the footage as the plow edge slammed directly into the curb in front of Walter's driveway, tearing through concrete and frozen sod before correcting itself. The room went completely silent. You could actually hear somebody cough in the back row. Evan paused the video. "And for the record," he said calmly, "the defendant's vehicle is visible in the driveway throughout the footage." There it was on screen. My Subaru, completely buried in untouched snow. Never moved. Never left the driveway. Walter looked like a man watching his own funeral. He started fumbling with papers, muttering something about incomplete footage, but nobody was listening anymore. The judge leaned back in her chair and let out this long, exhausted sigh like she was deeply disappointed civilization had brought her to this moment. "Case dismissed," she said. Then she looked directly at Walter. "And Mr. Grady, you are dangerously close to sanctions for filing a knowingly false claim. I have never seen another human being turn that specific shade of purple before or since." Walter opened his mouth twice like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. Even the neighbors sitting behind him looked embarrassed now. One of them actually shook his head and stared down at the floor. Outside the courthouse, snow drifted lightly across the sidewalk while people shuffled back to their cars pretending not to stare at us. Walter exited a few minutes later without looking at anybody. But right before he reached the parking lot, he stopped beside me. For a second I thought maybe this was the moment he'd apologize. Instead, he just said quietly, "People like you ruin neighborhoods." Then he walked away. And weirdly enough, that hurt more than the lawsuit ever did because it confirmed something I'd been trying not to believe the entire time. This was never about damage. It was never about parking. Walter needed someone to blame for the fact that his world was changing and he no longer felt important inside it. A month later, the city repaired the curb at no charge. The workers who came out had clearly heard the story already because one of them glanced toward Walter's house and muttered, "Guy really tried blaming you for this?" I just smiled and handed them coffee. But the neighborhood never fully recovered after that. Some people quietly stopped talking to Walter altogether. Others defended him, saying he was old-fashioned and embarrassed, and maybe the whole thing had gone too far. And honestly, I still don't know how I feel about it. Because humiliation changes people. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not. A few weeks later, I mailed Walter a copy of the city repair invoice, stamped $0 owed. Petty? Maybe. But after months of being treated like some outsider trespassing in my own home, it felt earned. The strange part is, spring eventually came. The snow melted, flowers came back, and one afternoon I caught Walter standing alone in his driveway staring at the repaired curb like he barely recognized the street anymore. He looked smaller somehow, older. For a second, I almost walked over there. Almost. But I didn't. Because some people don't really want peace, they want control. And the moment they lose it, they'd rather call themselves victims than admit they were wrong. So now I want to ask you this. If you were in my position, would you have let it go after the case was dismissed, or would you have exposed him the same way? And do you think Walter was truly malicious, or just lonely and bitter enough to convince himself of his own lie? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, People are still divided about it on that street to this day.